What do porcupines, secret tunnels, ghost queens, and powdered arsenic have in common? They all once roamed the gilded corridors of French royalty, sometimes literally. This isn't history as you learned it, it's weirder, pettier, smellier, and far more theatrical. Behind every jewel-crusted crown was a secret stash of scandal, superstition, or outright nonsense. So buckle your silk shoes, we're diving headfirst into 100 of the most ridiculous facts about the kings and queens of France. Before we tumble into powdered wigs and royal weirdness, make sure you're subscribed, especially if you like your history with a twist of absurd. Drop a comment while you're at it. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Montreal, 3 a.m. in Manila? Let's see how far the French monarchy's nonsense can travel. 1. The royal touch for scrofula. There are few things more absurdly powerful than a medieval public relations campaign, especially when it's attached to a monarch's fingertips. For centuries, French kings claimed the divine ability to cure scrofula, a grotesque form of tuberculosis that caused swollen, oozing lymph nodes. All they had to do was touch the afflicted. Just a light graze, maybe a whispered prayer, and voila, the divine bacteria-busting magic of absolute monarchy. They called it le miracle royal, though to the unhealed peasants it probably felt more like being patted condescendingly before dying in a ditch. This wasn't a side hustle, it was built into coronations. Kings were expected to perform public healings like saints with a throne. Never mind that most patients stayed sick or quietly died off stage. The spectacle was the point. It framed the king as God's chosen vessel, and the disease as merely an opportunity for him to flex. Which brings us to another man who wore a much more literal mask of mystery. 2. The man in the iron mask mystery. The only thing more mysterious than the divine healing hands of royalty is the royal tendency to disappear people. Under Louis XIV, one such vanishing act became legend, the man in the iron mask. He was arrested under a fake name, moved between high-security prisons, kept in a velvet mask, later dramatized as iron, and silenced for life. His guards were told, "Speak to him and die." He lived like a ghost in royal custody, his identity sealed tighter than his face. Was he a disgraced noble, a secret twin of the king, a political liability with too much information and too few allies? Voltaire said he knew, but he also said a lot of things, many while imprisoned himself. Dumas turned him into a swashbuckling plot device, and historians have since produced theories ranging from thrilling to pitiful. But no one knows. Louis XIV took that secret to his gloriously costumed grave. The same Louis who once healed with a touch and danced in tights as a literal sun god. And if you're still here, 2 ridiculous royal facts in, you clearly have excellent taste in chaos. So hit that subscribe button to keep the madness going. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it? Are you doom scrolling in Berlin at 2 a.m., hiding from your boss in broad daylight? Either way, you're in good company. 3. Louis XIV believed himself to have divine healing powers. Louis XIV didn't just inherit the French throne, he inherited the idea that God worked directly through him. It was a family business of divine ego. The earlier kings had already laid the groundwork with the royal touch, that sacred pat on the head for scrofula trick. But Louis took it further. He believed his mere presence could cure illness. People were told that if the king glanced their way, their symptoms would fade, as if sunlight itself burned the sickness out. Convenient theology, considering he called himself the Sun King. Courtiers claimed to feel miraculously better after being near him, though perhaps the real cure was realizing that collapsing in front of the monarch was career suicide. Doctors humored the myth, priests sanctified it, and the court applauded every time he sneezed, just in case it was divine weather. It was the perfect loop. God made Louis king, Louis embodied God, and France got a walking sermon in velvet shoes. But even heavenly kings crave something more theatrical than belief. Sometimes they need to show their light, which is why Louis decided to become the sun himself on stage. You're right. Thanks for the correction. Resuming now from the correct point in the list. 4. Louis XIV acted as Apollo in a ballet. Before he was the self-crowned Sun King of France, Louis XIV was just a teenager with a taste for wigs, mythological grandeur, and centre stage. In 1653, at the age of 14, Louis didn't just sponsor a ballet, he starred in it. Not as a nobleman, not as a prince, but as Apollo, god of the sun, rising at dawn to banish darkness from the world. Subtlety? Not his strong suit. The production was the Ballet de la Nuit, a 13-hour fever dream of royal pageantry, mythological cameos, and very expensive tights. The king's role came at the finale, of course. After hours of night-themed allegory, Louis emerged as the bringer of light, wearing golden robes and dancing to court-composed music. He didn't just play Apollo, he became him, or at least wanted the court to think so. This performance wasn't just a flex, it was policy. France wasn't going to be ruled by bureaucrats or barons, or even ministers. It was going to be ruled by the sun itself, or at least its very shiny teenage embodiment. The message was clear. The monarchy is divine, theatrical, and indisputably the main character. And the courtiers bought it. They applauded, flattered, mimicked. By turning himself into a literal celestial figure, Louis launched one of the most aggressive political rebranding campaigns in European history. He spent the rest of his life reinforcing it. From Versailles' solar alignment to state portraits soaked in gold, to the micromanagement of his image down to the tilt of his shoes. Louis XIV wasn't just a king, he was a symbol, a living metaphor, a state-sponsored ballet with real-world consequences. But self-deification isn't easy. It takes obsessive commitment, endless attention to detail, and a complete refusal to let anyone else share the spotlight, which is exactly why Louis soon made a bold move no other monarch dared. 5. The Sun King's obsession with control. After the death of Cardinal Mazarin, Louis XIV made an announcement that stunned the court. There would be no new chief minister. No Richelieu, no Mazarin 2.0, no convenient scapegoat. Just Louis, sole executive, eternal manager, god emperor with a stationary set. To most monarchs, ruling was a delegation game. You hired clever ministers to do the heavy lifting while you went hunting. But Louis thought differently. He believed that real power came from personal involvement in everything: policy, war, taxes, gardens, furniture design. If a single letter left Versailles without his review, it was considered borderline treasonous incompetence. He was up at dawn, reading memos, dictating instructions, attending 4, sometimes 5 councils a day. He knew the names of minor tax officials in rural provinces and personally signed off on who got to paint which wall in which gallery at Versailles. Did he trust his nobles? No. Did he keep them busy enough to avoid plotting? Absolutely. Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was a political machine disguised as a chandelier showroom. Rituals were weaponized. Access to the king was currency. The daily lever, when Louis rose from bed, was treated like a sacred ceremony, and courtiers fought bitterly for the privilege of holding his shirt. By burying the nobility in endless protocol and controlled proximity, Louis kept them too distracted to be dangerous. And the thing is, it worked. France expanded. The economy, while strained, boomed with spectacle. Culture thrived. Louis became the absolute monarch that absolutism was invented for. But control has a price. Beneath the golden mirrors, the court was cracking. Everyone was performing, no one was breathing, and Louis, in his infinite scrutiny, couldn't see that he'd built a theatre so airtight it couldn't vent its own smoke. Still, he remained the undimming star, even if some found his golden aura a bit blinding. But not all French kings chased the heavens. Some preferred something more down to earth, or more accurately, down to the forest floor. 6. Louis XII's royal emblem, the porcupine. While Louis XIV was busy becoming Apollo, his distant predecessor Louis XII took a very different branding route, one that involved 0 sun gods and maximum quills. His chosen royal emblem? The porcupine. Yes, really. While other monarchs rallied behind lions, eagles, and the occasional mythological beast, Louis XIV proudly hoisted the banner of a rodent best known for being unpettable. The symbolism? According to 16th century belief, porcupines could shoot their quills at enemies like tiny barbed missiles. It wasn't true, of course, but facts rarely stopped royal PR campaigns. The porcupine became a full-blown motif. It was engraved on cannons, stitched into robes, embossed on buildings, and even carved into cathedrals. His motto? Qui s'y frotte s'y pique. Who touches it gets pricked. Charming, a slogan worthy of a medieval t-shirt. But the porcupine wasn't just a quirky animal mascot. It was a statement. Louis XIII presented himself as peaceful, slow to provoke, but ready to defend with sharp efficiency. He wasn't interested in sun-themed choreography or divine light metaphors. He wanted you to know that yes, he might look quiet, but get too close, and you'd regret it. Ironically, Louis XII's reign was relatively stable. He was known as Le Père du Peuple, the father of the people, a modest, pragmatic king with no taste for gold-drenched palaces or theatre-state politics. But his porcupine became legendary. Even long after his death, the symbol lingered, a bristling reminder that sometimes the oddest emblems leave the sharpest impression. And yet, for all the animal metaphors and celestial performances, royal identity always walked a tightrope between absurdity and authority. Which brings us to a quote, one as biting as it is iconic, and a king who summarized French absolutism with stunning sarcastic precision. 7. I'm Louis XV and you're not. In the world of French royalty, authority didn't need explanation, or just presence, and few lines encapsulated that presence better than the supposed declaration by Louis XV, I'm Louis XV, and you're not. It sounds like a joke, a snarky meme centuries ahead of its time. But to his courtiers, it was a truth so obvious it didn't need a punchline. Whether he truly said it or not, and many historians suspect it was a satirical paraphrase passed around the salons, the quote survives because it perfectly captured the mood of Versailles under his reign. Louis XV was not the theatrical showman his great-grandfather had been. He didn't dance as Apollo or micromanage the kingdom like a god on earth. Instead, he radiated a sort of detached superiority, an elegant boredom that whispered, I don't need to explain myself. I'm already wearing the crown. This air of effortless entitlement was part of the performance. Power wasn't enforced through violence, it was maintained through indifference. Court life revolved around the king like furniture around a fireplace. Being ignored by Louis could ruin your career. Being acknowledged, even with a shrug, could make it. And in a court where you were judged by your seating position and who got to hand the king his shirt, a phrase like, and you're not, wasn't just smug, it was policy. But every performance needs a stage, and Louis XV's queen decided she wanted one that looked like anything but Versailles. Which brings us to a miniature village and a royal fantasy. 8. Marie Antoinette's Hamlet at Versailles. On the manicured grounds of Versailles, nestled not far from fountains, gilded halls, and the world's most high-maintenance landscaping, Marie Antoinette built herself a little village. That's right, a peasant village, with thatched roofs, wooden fences, goats, milkmaids, and a rustic little stream. She called it the Hameau de la Reine, the Queen's Hamlet. And no, it was not a joke. At first glance, It looked like a tribute to the simple life, but in reality, it was the world's most expensive costume set. Marie Antoinette and her inner circle would dress up as shepherdesses, milk cows symbolically, and pretend they were far, far away from court, far from the judgment, far from the rigid etiquette, far from politics. In her fantasy farm, the queen could play at normalcy without ever encountering it. The irony, of course, was razor sharp. While actual French peasants struggled with food shortages and rising taxes, their queen was frolicking through a designer version of poverty, complete with perfumed sheep. She wasn't mocking them, at least not intentionally. But the disconnect was so vast, it bordered on satire. Still, for Marie Antoinette, the Hamlet was more than whimsy. It was escape. Versailles was a theatre of surveillance, and she was always on stage. In the Hamlet, she could breathe, or at least pretend to, but you can only play at simplicity for so long before the real world kicks the door in. And Marie, despite the ribbons and milkmaids, was no fool. She knew the public eye was always watching, so while she played the part of the rustic queen, she was also quietly building a refuge for the mind, a library, one filled with thousands of books. 9. Marie Antoinette collected 5,000 books. She is remembered for her dresses, her hair, her parties, her diamonds, her Hamlet, her everything, except her books. But Marie Antoinette, despite the centuries of gossip and guillotine foreshadowing, was a reader, a prolific one. She amassed a personal library of more than 5,000 volumes covering literature, philosophy, science, botany, and plays. Her tastes were broad and sometimes subversive. She read Voltaire, Rousseau, and occasionally flirted with the kinds of ideas the court found unsettling. She didn't just collect books, she annotated them, she loaned them, she organized them, she took them seriously. This wasn't just an intellectual hobby. It was self-defense. The queen was surrounded by critics, caught in a court that watched her every gesture. Reading gave her space, a world where she wasn't just a queen in a corset, but a person with thoughts, private thoughts, dangerous thoughts perhaps, and yet history flattened her. It turned her into a caricature with cake crumbs on her gown. But buried in her private study was a woman wrestling with ideas far beyond powdered wigs and fashion scandals. She built her own refuge, not just in cottages but on paper. But not all royal symbols were so discreet. Sometimes the robe was too heavy, the ceremony too stiff, and the new king, well, he just wanted to breathe. 10. Louis XVI hated formal coronation clothes. In 1775, Louis XVI stood in Rheims Cathedral, draped in layers of velvet, gold embroidery, and symbolic discomfort. It was Coronation Day, the moment France welcomed its next absolute monarch with incense, chants, and several £100 of tradition stitched into one outfit. The only problem? Louis absolutely hated it. Shortly after the ceremony ended, he tried on the formal coronation robes again, briefly, then promptly took them off and refused to wear them ever again. Too heavy, too stiff, too absurd. For a king famously uninterested in spectacle, the ornate costume felt like a lie stitched in brocade. Louis was many things, awkward, indecisive, earnest, but he was not a showman. Unlike his predecessors who revelled in royal image, Louis preferred clocks to capes, locks to laurels. But public image, especially for a monarch, has a way of dressing you whether you like it or not. And while Louis was trying to keep his crown light, something far heavier was growing behind closed doors. An emotional entanglement that would blur the lines between monarchy, scandal, and espionage. 11. Marie Antoinette's rumoured love affair with Count von Fersen. Whispers, letters, and carefully guarded glances. The supposed relationship between Marie Antoinette and Count Axel von Fersen remains one of the most talked about and least resolved scandals of French royal history. A Swedish nobleman, dashing, discreet, and well-positioned in European diplomacy, Fersen entered Marie Antoinette's life during her early years at court. What began as friendship quickly raised eyebrows and then suspicions. Their letters reveal affection, emotional intimacy, longing disguised in flowery language and carefully coded phrases. Historians have debated for centuries whether their relationship was romantic, platonic, or something in between. What we know for sure, she trusted him deeply. He was involved in the royal family's attempted escape from Paris, the infamous flight to Varennes, and risked his life to help them flee. To her critics, this was confirmation of treachery. To her defenders, it was proof of loneliness, of humanity under siege. The monarchy, once divine, was now looking increasingly mortal and increasingly vulnerable. But court gossip wasn't satisfied with romantic intrigue alone. It needed something more scandalous, more unthinkable, and it found it during her trial. 12. Accusations of incest at Marie Antoinette's trial. When the revolution finally put Marie Antoinette on trial, the charges ranged from the predictable treason, mismanagement, to the horrific. Among them was one particularly vile accusation, that she had engaged in incest with her young son. There was no evidence, no testimony, just rumor weaponized as a moral execution. It was designed not to prove guilt, but to destroy character, to drag the image of the Queen so low that even sympathy would feel like betrayal. The courtroom buzzed. The audience, primed for outrage, waited for her to break, but she didn't. When asked to respond, Marie Antoinette said nothing at first. Then, with quiet fury, she answered not the judges, but the mothers in the room. "I appeal to all those who may have ever been mothers." It was a rare moment of dignity in a show trial meant to humiliate. The courtroom fell into silence. Even some of her enemies reportedly looked away. But the damage was done, the symbolism too potent to resist. The revolution didn't just want to end monarchy, it wanted to dismantle the myth that royalty was above humanity. And in the process, it revealed just how far a fallen crown could sink. 13. Heads on pikes. By 1792, the French Revolution was no longer fueled by rhetoric, it was powered by rage. And few symbols captured that rage more viscerally than the fate of the Princesse de Lamballe. A close confidant of Marie Antoinette and one of the few loyal figures still within her shrinking inner circle, Lamballe refused to denounce the monarchy. For that, she was arrested, brought before a tribunal, and swept into the brutal machinery of revolutionary justice. What happened next shocked even hardened revolutionaries. Her body was desecrated, her head placed on a pike and paraded through the streets, reportedly brought before Marie Antoinette's window in the hopes of breaking her spirit. The Queen fainted, or didn't, depending on which memoir you read. The symbolism, however, was loud and grotesquely clear. The revolution no longer feared spectacle, it embraced it. The incident marked a grim turning point, no longer just a political revolt. It was now a war of symbols, a violent rejection of the world Versailles had created. But even amidst this chaos, the royals were still clinging to hope and a plan to run. 14. Royal fugitives posing as servants. The plan was desperate, risky, and frankly a little theatrical. In 1791, the French royal family attempted to escape Paris under assumed identities. The operation was masterminded, in part, by Count von Fersen, Marie Antoinette's confidant, and it read like a historical heist novel. The Queen posed as a governess. The King pretended to be a valet. Their children and Madame Elisabeth were cast as noble wards under the fictional identity of a Russian baroness named Madame de Korff. The costumes were tailored, the route planned, the carriage was large and conspicuous, a detail that would prove fatal. They made it over 100 miles before they were recognized in the town of Varennes. The King's face, once stamped on coins, betrayed them. Locals called the National Guard. The escape failed. It wasn't just a physical capture, it was a symbolic one. The illusion that the monarchy could quietly slip away and regroup had shattered. The flight to Varennes revealed how little royal identity could be concealed. and how much of it still lingered, even beneath powdered wigs and borrowed titles. And from that day on, the guards stopped pretending to be polite. The royals would no longer be given the dignity of distance, not even at night. 15. The royals had their bedroom doors left open to guards. After the failed escape, the royal family returned to Paris not as monarchs, but as prisoners under surveillance. Their new home, the Tuileries Palace, became less a residence and more a gilded cage. Every movement was watched, every word noted, and even their most private spaces were stripped of privacy. Marie Antoinette, once the most protected woman in France, now slept with her bedroom doors left open. Guards stationed outside had direct sight into her chambers at all hours. It wasn't just about security, it was about control, about humiliation, about making a queen feel like a subject under interrogation. And yet, through all of this, the formalities remained. There were still court rituals, still audiences, still a shadow of the court life she had known, now awkwardly draped over an invisible prison wall. It was a strange half-life, neither full captivity nor full royalty, a limbo with curtains drawn and keys turned. And it only deepened the sense that the revolution was no longer trying to negotiate with the past. It was preparing to erase it. And for Louis XII, centuries earlier, erasure came in a different form, one that began with a forced marriage and ended with annulment, power, and porcupines. 16. Louis XII married a disabled, sterile princess under duress. Long before the revolution's drama unfolded, royal marriages were already entangled with coercion, politics, and personal sacrifice. Louis XII knew this better than most. In 1476, long before he became king, he was pressured into marrying Joan of France, the daughter of Louis XI, under what many believed to be a political power play rather than a voluntary union. Joan, by many accounts, was deeply pious, physically disabled, and rumoured to be unable to bear children. These traits made her, in her father's view, the perfect political tool, unlikely to claim influence, loyal and safe. Louis resisted the marriage, repeatedly, but resistance was futile when the bride's father was the sitting king. Louis XI effectively forced the match, ensuring that Joan's marriage neutralized Louis as a political rival. The result was a union marked more by obligation than affection, one that would be quietly shelved when Louis XII finally ascended to the throne, because once crowned, he had other plans and another woman in mind. 17. Annulment, so he could marry Anne of Brittany. The moment Louis XII became king in 1498, his first royal order of business wasn't war, reform, or palace building, it was an annulment. He petitioned the Pope to dissolve his marriage to Joan of France. The official reasons were predictably bureaucratic: lack of consummation, incompatibility, and distant blood relation. But everyone knew the real reason. Louis wanted to marry Anne of Brittany, the recently widowed queen of Charles VIII and heiress to a fiercely independent duchy. Brittany was valuable, wealthy, strategically vital. The marriage wasn't just romantic, though some believed Louis admired Anne personally. It was a political masterstroke. By marrying her, Louis ensured Brittany would be tied directly to the French crown, rather than drifting into potential alliances with England or Spain. Joan, for her part, didn't protest. She withdrew gracefully into a religious life, later founding a monastic order. But the annulment underscored a brutal truth about monarchy. Even sacred vows could be rewritten for strategic gain. And while the political map was being redrawn through marriage, royal rituals continued, including one that nearly fell apart in the most literal, splintered way. 18. The coffin breakdown at Louis XII's funeral. Death comes for everyone, even kings. But few royal farewells are quite as awkward as Louis XII's funeral procession. When the king died in 1515, his body was placed in a grand coffin draped in gold cloth and carried with pomp through the streets of Paris. It was supposed to be a solemn, glorious affair, an elegant passage into royal legacy. And then the cart broke. The carriage carrying the coffin malfunctioned mid-procession, coming to an unceremonious halt. The elaborate gold drapery slipped. The coffin jostled. Dignity gave way to logistical chaos. What followed was not mourning, but bickering. Courtiers and clergy began arguing, not over the legacy of the king, but over the golden cloth that had adorned the coffin. Who had rights to it? Was it royal property? Could it be claimed as a sacred token? Was it salvageable? The procession stalled, both literally and symbolically. Louis XII, known in life for his pragmatic rule, had his final moments upstaged by a royal squabble over textiles. But such was the court. Even in death, the pageantry never stopped. And for this king, the Porcupine banner still flew, resilient and slightly ridiculous. 19. Louis XII's Porcupine propaganda. Most monarchs were content with a coat of arms. Louis XII wanted something a bit more bristly. His chosen emblem, the porcupine, wasn't just a personal mascot, it was a full-blown propaganda campaign. You could find porcupines everywhere, carved into stone, painted onto war banners, engraved on cannons, embroidered into royal tapestries. They appeared in manuscripts etched into ceilings, and even integrated into stained glass. Not exactly the most intimidating animal, but in Louis's mind it sent the perfect message. Approach at your own risk. The symbolism was simple but clever. At the time, people believed porcupines could shoot their quills from a distance, like furry little archers. Whether true or not, it wasn't. The image stuck. The king, like the porcupine, was peaceful, until provoked. Then came the spikes. For Louis, this creature wasn't just a curiosity of the forest, it was the living metaphor of his political posture. This odd choice of branding gave him a unique legacy, less about grandeur, more about clever warning. But the future kings of France wouldn't rely on defensive symbolism. They'd learn firsthand how unstable power could be, especially if they spent their youth fleeing from angry mobs in their own capital. 20. Louis XIV fled Paris twice as a child. Before he was the Sun King, Louis XIV was just a frightened boy in a nightshirt, being rushed through palace corridors as angry mobs surged through Paris. Twice during his childhood, Louis was forced to flee the capital amid political unrest, events that left permanent scars on his royal psyche. The culprits were the Fronde, a series of revolts led by nobles and Parisians against the crown's growing centralization of power under Cardinal Mazarin, Louis's regent and godfather figure. The royal family found itself under siege, and more than once they were evacuated under cover of night. The young Louis witnessed firsthand what it meant for power to be fragile, for crowds to bang on palace gates, for loyalty to dissolve overnight. These events didn't just shape his worldview, they defined his reign. He developed a lifelong mistrust of Paris, a distaste for crowds, and a powerful desire to control every variable. Versailles, built later outside of the capital, was not just a palace. It was a fortress of ritual, a safe distance from rebellion, a place where no one could bang on the bedroom door uninvited. And so Louis vowed never again would a king flee, never again would Paris dictate to the throne. But history, as always, had other plans, including a reign so long it made the concept of coronation itself feel unnecessary. 21. Louis XIV's long reign made other coronations rare. Louis XIV reigned for so long, 72 years, the longest of any monarch in European history, that coronations practically went out of fashion. By the time his successor, Louis XV, ascended to the throne, most French citizens had never witnessed a coronation in their lifetime. For many, kingship was something abstract, something eternal. The idea of changing kings felt like rebooting the sun. This extreme longevity created a peculiar cultural moment. Royal succession became less a dramatic transition and more of a bureaucratic formality. The crown didn't pass, it lingered. Louis XIV's presence was so dominant, his control so enduring, that the very rituals of kingship began to fade into background ceremony. His rule stretched across generations, wars, styles, philosophies, and technologies. It was hard to imagine anything different, and when Louis XV finally took the throne in 1715, the monarchy had aged with its monarch. The challenge wasn't just ruling, it was rebooting relevance, because when a monarchy becomes timeless, it also risks becoming lifeless. And lifeless myths, as one queen would soon discover, make excellent targets, especially when you're being accused of saying things you never said at all. 22. Marie Antoinette's "let them eat cake" quote is bogus. Of all the phrases stapled to Marie Antoinette's legacy, none is more infamous or more fictional than "let them eat cake." Supposedly uttered in response to news that the peasantry lacked bread, the quote has long been used to frame her as the ultimate symbol of royal indifference. Except she never said it. The phrase first appeared in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, written when Marie Antoinette was still a child. Rousseau attributes it vaguely to a great princess, not naming anyone. Later revolutionaries, eager for a villain, retrofitted the quote onto the Queen to serve a narrative of detached aristocracy. It stuck. Marie Antoinette, ironically, was known to donate to the poor and expressed concern, however limited, about their condition. But nuance never makes good propaganda. So the myth lived on, turning a politically isolated queen into a cartoon villain of pastry apathy. Still, if she didn't say it, where did the public get their image of her debauchery? Simple, they read it, in pamphlets that spared no imagination and even less dignity. 23. Pamphlets claiming wild court debauchery. The French Revolution didn't just attack the monarchy with pitchforks, it used paper, lots of it. Pamphlets, printed cheaply and circulated widely, became one of the most powerful weapons against the royal family. And when it came to Marie Antoinette, those pamphlets pulled no punches. She was accused of everything from political treason to elaborate and improbable love triangles. Some even claimed she held secret orgies in hidden rooms of Versailles, engaged in affairs with her female friends, or manipulated the king through dark arts and manipulation. Most of it was pure fiction, lurid tabloid fantasy designed to enrage. But it worked. The public, already seething over taxes and famine, found in these scandal sheets a convenient symbol for everything wrong with the regime. Truth became optional. Outrage was the currency. The pamphlets weren't created in isolation. They were part of a coordinated effort to strip the monarchy of its mystique, to turn kings and queens into punchlines, or worse, into threats. And the Queen wasn't the only target. Her husband, Louis XVI, was accused of betraying the nation in ways far more concrete. 24. Louis XVI was accused of sending French money to Austria. By the late 1780s, France's economic crisis had become a national obsession. Bread prices soared, debts mounted, and the people were desperate for someone to blame. Louis XVI, already seen as indecisive, made an easy target. But it wasn't just incompetence they accused him of, it was betrayal. Rumours spread that the king was secretly funneling French funds to Austria, Marie Antoinette's homeland, and thereby aiding the enemy. The Queen's Austrian birth had long been a point of suspicion, but during the Revolution it became political poison. Every diplomatic misstep, every military failure was painted as part of a Habsburg conspiracy. In truth, Louis did maintain secret correspondence and had personal sympathies with Austria's royal family. But was he bankrolling foreign enemies? No solid proof ever emerged. Still, perception was reality, and reality was no longer royal. To many, the king was not just inept, but treasonous, and with treason came trials. But when the revolution put Marie Antoinette on the stand, it wasn't just her politics under scrutiny, it was her motherhood. 25. Marie Antoinette withheld responses in court over incest. During her trial in 1793, Marie Antoinette faced a catalogue of allegations, many designed not to prove guilt but to destroy character. One of the most disturbing was the claim that she had engaged in inappropriate behaviour with her son, a charge based on nothing more than rumour and cruelty. When pressed in court to respond, she refused to dignify the accusation directly. Instead, she said, "I appeal to all mothers," a short but powerful statement that shifted the trial from political theatre to something deeply personal. The courtroom fell into silence. Even those who despised her reportedly looked away. It was one of the few moments where the Queen, now prisoner, managed to reclaim some moral ground. She didn't win her case, of course. The outcome was never in doubt, but in refusing to defend herself against something so grotesque, she highlighted how far her enemies were willing to go, and how little the trial was about justice. But the evidence against her wasn't limited to spoken words. There were also papers, hidden ones. 26. Royal secrets hidden in an iron chest. In November 1792, revolutionaries discovered a hidden compartment in the Tuileries Palace, a concealed safe known as the armoire de fer, or iron chest. Inside were hundreds of documents, many signed by Louis XVI himself. Letters, political memoranda, secret correspondences with foreign powers and ministers. The find was explosive. It confirmed what many had suspected, that the king had been secretly negotiating with foreign monarchies, plotting escape plans and trying to undermine the revolution from within. To the revolutionaries, this wasn't just a scandal, it was betrayal in ink. The documents directly contradicted the royal family's public denials. They weren't passive victims of change, they were active conspirators, or so the papers suggested. This chest, locked and buried in a palace wall, became a symbol of royal duplicity, proof that behind the powdered faces and courtly manners, the old order was still trying to survive through back channels. Its discovery was a turning point. Trust, already thin, evaporated entirely, and yet even before this moment, the monarchy had already become a punchline, thanks to the very writers and thinkers who once bowed before it. 27. Courtiers turned to satire and mockery. As the monarchy lost its grip on the people, it also lost its dignity in the eyes of its own courtiers. Satire became the secret language of survival at Versailles. Nobles, intellectuals, and even once loyal servants began crafting caricatures, whispering jokes, and passing around poems mocking royal excess, court protocol, and the increasingly absurd rituals that once propped up divine authority. Pamphlets, cartoons, and coded plays lampooned everything from Marie Antoinette's wardrobe to Louis XVI's hesitations. The aura of untouchability cracked not under revolutionaries first, but under wits with powdered wigs and sharp pens. This was a cultural unravelling, the slow collapse of reverence into ridicule. Mockery became a form of rebellion long before the Bastille fell. It gave people permission to see the monarchy not as majestic, but as ridiculous. Kings became punchlines, queens became costumes, and the monarchy, still rich, still powerful, became a bloated relic sitting uncomfortably at the edge of modernity, a transformation that even kings themselves sometimes tried to resist from their deathbeds. 28. Louis XIII's last will tried to limit royal excesses. By the time Louis XIII lay on his deathbed in 1643, he had seen enough royal extravagance to worry about what might come next. His solution? A will, not just any will, a detailed political document meant to curb the more indulgent tendencies of the monarchy after his death. He tried to set limits on the power of regents, on the spending habits of the court, and on the unchecked autonomy that kings so easily inherited. It was, in many ways, a royal speed bump, a cautious monarch trying to install brakes on a vehicle built for acceleration. But as with most such attempts, it was quickly ignored. His son, Louis XIV, barely 5 years old at the time, would grow into a king whose reign embodied everything his father feared: unchecked power, limitless spectacle, and a court that ran on ritual rather than restraint. Ironically, the very thing Louis XIII tried to avoid, the myth of royal divinity, would be amplified to its most theatrical extreme under his son's rule, beginning, of course, with the paintings. 29. Louis XIV's theatrical self-image. Louis XIV wasn't content with being king. He wanted to be seen as a king, the kind of king painted not just with crowns and scepters, but with metaphors. In portraits, he wasn't just Louis. He was Mars, he was Jupiter, he was Apollo. In every canvas, he stood with poise and symbolism, surrounded by allegory and adorned with the visual vocabulary of gods and legends. One of his most famous portraits features him in coronation robes, velvet, ermine, sword at his hip, one leg confidently exposed, as if casually stepping onto history itself. The painter, Hyacinthe Rigaud, didn't just capture a man, he staged a myth. Louis commissioned art as political theatre, reinforcing the message that his authority wasn't just legal, it was eternal, cosmic, necessary. These portraits were not subtle, but then they weren't supposed to be. They were propaganda, polished in oil and hung like sacred relics. Because Louis understood, if you looked like a god long enough, people might start believing you were one. And yet not every king was so eager to wear his crown. Some, in fact, actively avoided it. 30. A king who refused to wear his crown. In the long line of French monarchs, there were kings who gloried in their regalia, and kings who preferred not to feel like a walking jewelry display. Some monarchs, particularly in later centuries, refused to wear the heavy crown outside of ceremonial obligations. The reasons ranged from physical discomfort to symbolic fatigue. After all, a crown, often made of solid gold and encrusted with gems, could weigh several pounds and cause serious neck strain. Literal burden of leadership. But beneath the surface, there was also a shift in tone. As the absolutist image began to erode, some kings seemed less enthusiastic about performing majesty on command. They still ruled, still held power, but there was a growing sense that all the gilded symbols weren't fooling anyone anymore. The crown remained a symbol of authority, but fewer monarchs seemed eager to parade around in it. The image of power was changing, and so were the rituals that surrounded it. Even royal births, once steeped in protocol and grandeur, began happening in increasingly strange and often chaotic places. 31. Royal births in bizarre circumstances. Royal births were meant to be immaculate productions, ceremonial, public to an uncomfortable degree, and heavily choreographed by protocol. But in reality, not all heirs to the French throne entered the world in polished Versailles chambers. Some were born in travel lodges while accompanying armies or even mid-hunt. One dauphin was famously delivered while the king was on a hunting trip, forcing the royal party to improvise a makeshift birthing suite in the countryside. Despite the grandeur associated with monarchy, the logistics of childbirth didn't always respect the crown's schedule. Roads were bad, wars were frequent, queens were often expected to accompany kings even during long campaigns, and when nature decided it was time, royal physicians and wet nurses had to work with whatever space was available. These strange locations didn't necessarily diminish the child's claim to the throne, but they did highlight the awkward truth that even royal blood arrives in very human ways. But while births might defy planning, the supernatural still lingered in every royal chamber, especially when omens began to appear. 32. Royal superstition and omens. French kings, despite their divine right and rational advisors, were often deeply superstitious. Dreams, comets, eclipses, all were seen as potential signs from higher powers. When strange phenomena occurred, even the most confident monarchs paid attention. Lunar eclipses were interpreted as warnings. Comets were feared as portents of death. If a royal horse tripped on the morning of a coronation, it could set nerves rattling for days. Louis XIV himself kept astrologers close, and many nobles quietly consulted mystics before making big decisions. These weren't fringe beliefs, they were baked into the culture of the court. Predictions influenced travel plans, military campaigns, even marriages. A single odd birthmark or unusual weather event could send courtiers whispering about destiny or disaster. The line between ritual and paranoia was thin, and the court was filled with both, which made sense. When your legitimacy is built on divine favor, you tend to watch the skies a little nervously. And when you fear the wrath of the stars, it helps to have rules, lots of them. 33. Extraordinary court etiquette rules. At Versailles, etiquette wasn't just a matter of manners, it was a governing system. Every gesture, every seat, every piece of silverware had a hierarchy attached to it. There were rules about how to bow, how to stand, when to speak, and, crucially, when to stay silent. A noble could rise or fall in influence based solely on how correctly they executed the morning lever, the royal wake-up ritual where courtiers helped the king get dressed. One false move, one misstep in protocol, and years of social climbing could unravel. There were even detailed instructions for how to remove a hat in the king's presence. Not too fast, not too slow, and always with the right hand. If the king stood, everyone stood. If the king sat, everyone waited to see who else would be allowed to sit. It was theatre, but with very real consequences, and to survive it, courtiers needed sharp instincts or a soft companion to help ease the tension, preferably something fluffy. 34. Favourite pets, eccentric animals. At the court of France, animals weren't just companions, they were characters in the royal drama. Kings and queens kept all sorts of pets, from the typical lapdogs to more exotic creatures like monkeys, parrots, and peacocks. One monarch was reportedly so fond of a particular horse that he wrote poems about it, treating it as a trusted confidant rather than just a means of transportation. These pets weren't mere distractions, they were status symbols and sometimes subtle political tools. A royal's favourite dog might receive its own attendants, sleeping quarters, and customised accessories. To be seen walking the palace grounds with the Queen's greyhound was a privilege. To accidentally step on the king's spaniel, a potential social disaster. These eccentric relationships weren't lost on the court, and many nobles tried to emulate them, sparking miniature arms races in pet fashion and animal training. But for all the exotic flair, sometimes a king's image came down to something even simpler, like the size of his nose. 35. Strange royal nicknames. Nicknames in royal circles were rarely affectionate. They were observations, often unfiltered, sometimes brutal, and occasionally embraced. Take Francis I of France, for example. Among his many titles and accolades, he was also known as François du Grand Nez, or Francis of the Big Nose, not exactly a term of endearment, but undeniably accurate. His distinctive nose was so prominent it became a recognizable feature in portraits and descriptions, a royal trademark, whether he liked it or not. Other monarchs earned nicknames based on quirks, habits, or political actions. Louis the Fat, Charles the Bald, Pepin the Short. These weren't courtly euphemisms, they were historical labels that stuck, passed down through generations, and often outliving any of the more flattering titles inscribed on coins or tombs. What these nicknames show is that even at the highest levels of power, image could slip into caricature, and in a court obsessed with grandeur, the smallest oddity could become legend. Sometimes those legends extended beyond people, into the treasures they carried, lost and sometimes never found. 36. Lost treasure and discarded valuables. The French court was not known for packing light. Jewelry, gilded furnishings, ceremonial robes and priceless trinkets travelled with the monarchy like over-decorated baggage trains. But in times of crisis, war, revolution, sudden flight, those treasures were often abandoned, hidden, or simply vanished. During the Revolution, royals fleeing Paris were rumoured to have sewn gems into the linings of dresses or stashed gold behind palace panels. In earlier periods, soldiers looted camps where kings had camped, discovering discarded chalices, forgotten rings, or sealed boxes too heavy to carry. Some treasures turned up years later in attics or cellars. Others were never found, fueling rumours of royal caches buried in forests or tucked inside remote chateaux. The stories endure not because they're proven, but because they tap into something irresistible. The idea that even in collapse, the monarchy clung to its sparkle. And for those chasing that lost glitter, there was always hope, or a map, leading to something once touched by royalty. 37. Royal kitchens and exotic food demands. French royalty didn't just eat to live, they dined to dazzle. Meals at court were as much performance as nourishment, with banquets lasting for hours and menus designed to impress foreign dignitaries, local nobles, and curious onlookers alike. The royal kitchens, sprawling operations within the palace, employed dozens of cooks, bakers, butchers, and tasters, all working under intense pressure to prepare elaborate, often outrageous meals. Peacocks served with their feathers reattached, roasted swans, and pastries shaped like mythical beasts were all part of the spectacle. Exotic spices from the east, rare fruits from colonial outposts, and ingredients transported over hundreds of miles were essential not just for taste, but for status. The more improbable the dish, the higher the prestige. But with such extravagance came occasional misfires. Some dishes caused illness or outright disgust among courtiers. Others, though perfectly prepared, became the subject of ridicule due to their over-the-top presentation. Still, food was power, and in a court where every detail was scrutinized, even your dinner plate sent a message. Behind the heavy doors of the royal kitchens, however, something even more important was brewing. Whispers, secrets, and surveillance. 38. Royal bedchamber, intrigues and spies. The royal bedchamber might have seemed like the most private room in the palace, but in Versailles, privacy was a luxury rarely granted. Behind the embroidered curtains and ceremonial bedsheets, politics never truly stopped. Servants, ladies-in-waiting, and even trusted advisors moved through the royal quarters, some as loyal attendants, others as informants. Hidden passageways allowed for discreet movement through the palace. What looked like a decorative panel might actually conceal a corridor leading straight to a rival's chambers. Courtiers eavesdropped from behind screens, letters were intercepted and copied, and conversations meant to be whispered often ended up circulating in salons the very next day. The royal bedchamber was a theatre of performance and pretense. Affairs of the heart intertwined with affairs of state, and rumours born in the shadows of canopy beds could upend alliances or ruin reputations. It was dangerous to speak freely, but even more dangerous not to. Because in a palace where everyone was listening, silence itself could be suspicious. And that suspicion only grew when claims to the throne became murky, especially with so many marriages, annulments, and whispered illegitimate heirs swirling through the bloodline. 39. Multiple marriages, annulments, bastard claims for French royalty. Marriage was rarely about love. It was strategy, diplomacy, and survivals. And sometimes all three, revised repeatedly. Kings married to unite kingdoms, dissolve tensions, or stake claims to foreign thrones. But when alliances soured or better options emerged, those marriages could be swiftly undone. Annulments were more common than romantic success. Louis XII famously annulled his marriage to Joan of France to wed Anne of Brittany, a political move disguised as piety. Future kings followed suit. Political necessity often outweighed spiritual vows, but where marriage tangled, lineage twisted even more. Rumours of illegitimate children haunted nearly every French king. Some of these children were acknowledged, and given titles or estates. Others were quietly hidden, raised in obscurity, or used as political bargaining chips. The line between royal and not quite royal was thin, and the consequences, if such children grew ambitious, could be explosive. In a court obsessed with bloodlines and succession, every whispered claim had weight. And when kings died young, or came to power too soon, the real decisions were often made by the people pulling strings behind the velvet curtain. 40. Regents who overreached whenever a French king inherited the throne as a child, and this happened often enough to become its own genre of crisis. Someone had to step in and help. That someone was usually a regent, and the most powerful regents were often queens or mothers. Case in point, Anne of Austria, mother of Louis XIV. As regent during his minority, she didn't simply hold the throne warm, she ruled it. With Cardinal Mazarin by her side, Anne made major political decisions, negotiated foreign treaties, and crushed uprisings. Her power was technically temporary, but she used it like a permanent office. And though she ruled in her son's name, it was no secret whose signature was driving policy. When Louis eventually took full control, he remembered the lessons well, especially the danger of allowing anyone else to steer the ship. Overreaching regents were a recurring feature of French monarchy. Sometimes they stabilized the realm. Other times they became lightning rods for rebellion. Either way, they served as cautionary tales, reminders that the throne was never really empty, even when the king was too young to sit on it. And for those in power, vigilance wasn't just wise, it became an obsession. 41. Royal paranoia and secret police. Absolute monarchs like Louis XIV didn't just rule, they watched constantly. The court of Versailles was a glittering prison of etiquette, but beneath the surface, it functioned like a surveillance state. Letters were opened, conversations were overheard, servants doubled as informants, and the king's network of spies extended deep into the aristocracy and bureaucracy. Louis had every reason to be wary. He'd fled Paris as a child during the Fronde uprisings and knew firsthand what rebellion looked like. His response was simple: preemption. He cultivated a court culture where everyone was seen, everyone was heard, and nothing happened unnoticed. Even the smallest slight could be recorded, analyzed, and remembered. Nobles who expressed too much independence found themselves suddenly reassigned or banished. Foreign ambassadors often reported being followed or having their quarters inspected. It wasn't paranoia if everyone really was watching you. This culture of controlled fear wasn't just defensive, it was strategy. Power could be projected not only by military force, but by the illusion that the king knew everything. And nowhere was that illusion more carefully crafted than at Versailles, where daily life became a tightly choreographed performance. 42. Louis XIV's obsession with Versailles rituals. Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was a stage, and Louis XIV was both playwright and star. Every moment of his day followed a rigid public script. From the lever, the royal waking ceremony, to the coucher, the bedtime ritual, the king's movements were a form of living propaganda. Nothing was spontaneous. Everything was observed. Courtiers vied for the smallest roles in this drama, holding a sleeve, passing a napkin, announcing the soup. These acts weren't trivial, they were social currency. Being seen with the king, even briefly, could launch a career or secure a marriage alliance. Failing to show up at the right moment, potential exile. The king's meals, walks, and prayers were all set pieces. Even his moments of supposed solitude were strategically visible. The effect was deliberate, to remind everyone, always, who held the center of gravity. Versailles wasn't designed for comfort, it was built for control. And in the quiet hours between rituals, when courtiers had a moment to themselves, some turned to poetry, and some to love. 44. Poisoning fears. In the shadowed halls of French royal courts, fear of poison was less paranoia and more protocol. From the 16th century through the 18th, kings and courtiers alike lived with a persistent, anxious suspicion that any goblet, plate, or bowl might carry more than just seasoning. The threat wasn't unfounded. Several nobles died under mysterious circumstances, and the infamous affair of the poisons during Louis XIV's reign revealed an underground network of fortune-tellers, alleged poisoners, and shady alchemists. As a result, elaborate precautions became standard. Food tasters were employed, special cups made of silver or other anti-poison materials were favoured. Some monarchs even kept their own food under lock and key, or insisted on being served only by select, trusted staff. Recipes were tightly controlled, and kitchens were watched almost as closely as war rooms. But this climate of suspicion didn't dampen appetites. It just added another layer of performance. Dining became a ritual of trust, with every bite a test of loyalty. And when they weren't fearing their food, royals were often starring in it, literally, through the theatrical spectacles known as court masks and ballets. 43. Royal lovesickness poems. For all the formality of court life, French royals, like anyone else, occasionally got lost in their feelings, and when they did, they often reached for ink. Kings and their courtiers wrote love poems, sometimes to mistresses, sometimes to would-be lovers, and occasionally just to their own sense of romantic suffering. These weren't literary masterpieces, though some tried, but they were heartfelt, sometimes embarrassingly so. Louis XV, for instance, was known to pen affectionate verses to his favourites, often delivered alongside gifts or slipped into letters. Even Louis XIV, amid wars and building Versailles, found time to dabble in poetic flattery. Many of these love letters and verses survive, tucked away in royal archives or published posthumously by amused historians. The poems ranged from flowery to painfully awkward, often overusing metaphors about light, roses, stars, and destiny. Still, they reveal something rarely seen in marble statues and formal portraits: vulnerability. Even kings had crushes, and in a court filled with intrigue, every whisper of love came with its own risks, especially when the wine was poured and the wrong ears were listening. Because in a palace where ambition and rivalry simmered beneath every glance, the next fear was never far away, especially when it came to poison. 46. Royal competition in fashion. At Versailles, fashion wasn't personal, it was political. Clothing operated like a social scoreboard, and staying on trend could mean the difference between rising in influence or being politely exiled from relevance. Kings and queens set the tone, but courtiers competed fiercely to outshine one another, often spending fortunes on the latest styles, fabrics, and accessories. Queen Marie Antoinette became the fashion lightning rod of her time. Her hairstyles defied architecture, towering with feathers, ships, and miniature gardens. Her gowns changed so often that tailors struggled to keep up, and new dresses were sometimes worn only once. Nobles followed suit, creating a constant churn of trends that emptied pockets and filled gossip columns. To wear last season's sleeves was practically treason, but with each hemline and powdered wig came judgment. The court didn't just watch what you wore, it catalogued it. And if the king noticed your ensemble, career made. If he didn't, well, there was always next season. Unless you vanished before it arrived, sometimes fashion wasn't the only thing disguised at court. The king himself might be hiding too. 45. Royal ballet and mask performances. Before French monarchs became symbols of solemn authority, they were performers, sometimes literally. Royal court entertainment in the 16th and 17th centuries frequently featured kings and courtiers participating in ballets, masks, and elaborate plays. Louis XIV is the most famous example, having performed as Apollo in the Ballet de la Nuit, but he wasn't the only one. Court life often required nobles to act, dance, and even sing as part of state-sponsored pageantry. These productions were no mere after-dinner amusements. They were political theatre, carefully staged to project power, harmony, and divine right. Costumes were rich, sets extravagant, and scripts packed with flattering allegory. When the king appeared on stage, he wasn't just dancing, he was reminding everyone that he was the centre of the universe. Participation in these events was both a privilege and a performance review. To dance well was to be seen as graceful, worthy, and loyal. To fumble was, well, unfortunate. The court kept score, and when the dancing stopped, the next contest began, this time on the battlefield of fashion. 48. Queens, private salons, and secret societies. Beneath the glittering hierarchy of court life, queens carved out spaces of their own, salons, gatherings, and private rooms where the rules were looser and the conversation far more dangerous. Marie Antoinette, for instance, kept a tight circle of trusted friends and confidants in her Petit Trianon and Hameau de la Reine. There, politics gave way to intimacy, and titles mattered less than discretion. These salons weren't always political. Many focused on art, philosophy, or literature, but they were powerful. Ideas were shared freely. Opinions were voiced that would never survive the throne room, and within these informal spaces, influence flowed not through decree, but through charm, persuasion, and presence. Occasionally, these groups bordered on secret societies. Passwords, private entrances, even coded letters, all were part of maintaining privacy. For a queen constantly watched, these salons were rare sanctuaries, but they were also magnets for suspicion. In a world where every whisper echoed, even leisure could sound like conspiracy, and some royals built entire shadow courts to make sure they were never without an audience of their own. 47. Kingly processions in heavy disguise. Despite their obsession with public image, French kings occasionally ventured out, anonymously. Disguises weren't just theatrical flair, they were political tools, often used to escape the suffocating rituals of court and observe the real world without fanfare. Louis XV and Louis XVI both engaged in this royal habit, donning plain clothes, adopting false names, and traveling incognito to see how their people lived, or at least how they talked when the crown wasn't watching. These secret excursions weren't always subtle. A royal carriage with a royal escort tends to attract attention, even if the monarch inside is pretending to be Monsieur Durand. Still, the disguise gave kings a rare kind of intelligence, first-hand observations, real conversations, and occasionally uncomfortable truths. It was also risky. One wrong word, one familiar face, and the whole illusion collapsed. But sometimes these undercover operations weren't about espionage. They were about control, a king's way of checking loyalty, reading sentiment, and reminding himself of a world beyond gold mirrors and silk drapery. And while the kings went incognito, queens preferred their secrecy indoors, often in salons where power whispered behind closed doors. 50. Child kings and child queens. France had more than its share of monarchs who wore the crown before they could properly hold a sceptre. From Charles IX to Louis XIII, and most famously Louis XIV, child kings often inherited the throne after the untimely death of a parent. Their reigns started early, their understanding of politics much later, and into that vacuum stepped regents, advisors, and sometimes dangerously ambitious courtiers. Being a child monarch meant growing up on a throne with everyone watching and often everyone scheming. Tutors became power brokers. Mother regents like Catherine de' Medici or Anne of Austria wielded enormous influence, sometimes more than their sons ever did. Nobles tried to shape the young rulers' preferences, win their favour, or quietly outmaneuver them before they came of age. In public, these kings were paraded as symbols of stability. In private, their decisions were often dictated by others, and when they finally took full power, they did so with a deep understanding of how quickly that power could slip or be stolen. That paranoia often extended into their personal lives. including how they handled their not-so-secret families. 49. Royal shadow courts. In the glittering main court of Versailles, everyone knew their rank, their ritual, and their place in the king's orbit. But just outside that radiant centre, other courts were quietly forming. These were the shadow courts, semi-official circles built around powerful royal relatives like princes, dukes, or former favourites. While technically loyal to the crown, they often operated like rival kingdoms, complete with their own courtiers, gossip networks, alliances, and sometimes subtle opposition strategies. A disfavoured noble might retreat into one of these shadow courts to rebuild their influence. A younger royal, too far from the throne to rule but too close to ignore, might use theirs to gather loyal followers, fashion trends, or even stir political sentiment. Some of these alternate courts stayed harmless, little more than cliques with better upholstery. Others, though, flirted with rebellion or intrigue, becoming breeding grounds for dissent cloaked in courtly etiquette. And in times of dynastic instability, the true power didn't always sit on the main throne. Sometimes it wore a child's crown, with adults doing all the ruling behind it. 52. Exile, disguise, and wandering royals. After the revolution swept away the old order, many members of the French royal family were forced into exile, not as kings and queens, but as refugees, often stripped of title, fortune, and familiarity. Some went to Austria or England. Others wandered across Europe in disguise, adopting false names and blending into foreign societies where their bloodlines meant little and their former glory meant even less. These once powerful figures now found themselves begging for shelter, living off sympathetic monarchs or former allies, and sometimes resorting to pawning personal items for survival. The contrast was jarring. A princess who once presided over Versailles might now live in a drafty attic in Prussia. A former duke might pass as a common merchant, carrying forged papers and haunted memories. What followed them, though, wasn't just misfortune, it was myth. Exiled royals became legends in motion, living ghosts of a fallen world. Some were romanticized, others were forgotten. And when death finally came, even their burials couldn't escape the chaos. 51. Hidden love children acknowledged posthumously. In the tangled genealogies of French royalty, official bloodlines were just the beginning. Many monarchs, including Louis XIV and Louis XV, had illegitimate children, born from affairs with mistresses, chambermaids, or favoured courtiers. Some of these children were quietly raised away from court. Others were openly acknowledged, granted titles, lands, and even roles in court life, though never officially placed in the line of succession. Sometimes these children were only confirmed after the king's death, through letters, secret payments, or sudden property transfers. It was a delicate dance. Deny too strongly, and you risked dishonouring someone beloved. Admit too much, and you risked scandal or dynastic confusion. Still, kings often felt compelled to provide for these children in some way, even if quietly. For the royals, blood was complicated. Legitimacy was a legal construct, but affection didn't always follow protocol. And after the fall of the monarchy, many of these once hidden heirs found themselves wandering through Europe with only a name, a locket, and a story. 54. Royal gambling and high stakes. French royalty had a notorious appetite for games of chance. Gambling wasn't just a vice, it was an accepted, even celebrated part of court life. At Versailles, nobles and royals would gather in gilded salons to play cards, roll dice, and place absurdly high-stakes bets. Fortunes were won and lost in a single evening. Reputation, too. Louis XV was especially fond of gambling, sometimes playing through the night with his favourites. Tables were surrounded by courtiers hoping to win silver or favour, preferably both. Games like Pharaoh, Biribi, and Trick-Track were common, and the atmosphere was a mix of celebration and calculation. While some saw gambling as harmless entertainment, others considered it corrosive. Debts mounted, tensions flared, and more than once, accusations of cheating led to scandal or quiet exile. But the thrill remained. In a world built on performance and artifice, games of chance offered something dangerously real, the possibility of genuine loss. And when tensions reached their peak, sometimes words failed and swords were drawn. 53. Royal burial chaos. Royal funerals were meant to be majestic, solemn processions, elaborate tombs, and centuries of ceremonial tradition. But the French monarchy's collapse left little room for dignity. During the Revolution, many royal tombs were desecrated. Corpses were exhumed from the royal necropolis at Saint-Denis, scattered, looted, and lost to history. Coffins were broken open. Bones were dumped into mass graves. Later, under Napoleon and the restored monarchy, attempts were made to reassemble the royal dead, but the damage was done. For some monarchs, their final resting places are still debated. Remains were misplaced, identities confused, and monuments erected with more hope than certainty. Even after the monarchy's symbolic return during the Bourbon Restoration, burial customs never fully recovered. Some royals were buried hastily in exile or returned to France years later under politically tense conditions. In death, as in life, the monarchy found itself unable to escape the weight of drama. But among the living royals, and even the exiled ones, some found solace not in ceremony but in cards. 56. Royal obsession with astrology and portents. The French royal court may have been lavish and rational on the surface, but beneath its gilded ceilings, many kings were secretly ruled by the stars. Astrology was taken seriously by both monarchs and advisors, especially during uncertain times. Eclipses, planetary alignments, and comets were read as messages from the heavens, sometimes hopeful, often ominous. Court astrologers were employed to advise on everything from coronation dates to travel plans. Louis XIV, despite his image as the rational Sun King, maintained interest in astrological predictions, especially during war or illness. Earlier monarchs, like Catherine de' Medici's sons, were known to base major decisions on celestial readings. These beliefs weren't considered unscientific at the time. Astrology was seen as part of a broader understanding of the natural order, and when logic failed, kings turned to the cosmos. In a world where power could vanish overnight, the stars at least appeared permanent, but even stars weren't more adored than the royal pets, and some animals, it turns out, carried political weight of their own. 55. Royal duels and personal combats. Though kings themselves rarely engaged in personal combat, dueling was deeply woven into the culture of French aristocracy. Nobles fought to defend honor, resolve grudges, or assert status, often in the name of royal protocol. Duels took place in gardens, forests, and private salons, usually governed by strict etiquette. Seconds were appointed, rules were agreed upon, and the combat, while sometimes lethal, was often more symbolic than deadly. Even when duels were discouraged by royal edict, they never disappeared. Louis XV and Louis XIV both issued laws to ban or limit dueling, but enforcement was spotty. After all, how do you punish half your court for doing what's expected of them? Duels were about pride, not politics, yet their outcomes often rippled through court life, determining who gained favor or fell into disgrace. And as the court became increasingly obsessed with omens and appearances, even the stars were consulted before blades were drawn. 57. Pets as political symbols. In royal France, even the animals had agendas. A king's favorite dog, parrot, or horse could become more than just a companion. It could be a symbol, a status marker, even a passive-aggressive political statement. Courtiers paid attention to which animal the monarch favored, and they adjusted accordingly. If the king's greyhound received daily kisses and its own velvet cushion at court, then suddenly greyhounds became fashionable. If a rival's pet was snubbed or attacked, that could carry social consequences. Some royal pets became legendary. Louis XIV adored his hunting dogs, who were treated with the same ceremony as minor nobles. One story tells of a favourite dog that was mourned more publicly than some courtiers. And woe to anyone who offended the royal pet. Tales exist of careers damaged not by scandal, but by stepping on the wrong paw. In Versailles, power was displayed in every corner, even under the table. But above the table, in the king's favour, sat someone even more powerful, the royal mistress. 58. Royal mistresses wielded real power. Behind every powerful king, there was often a mistress, and in the French court, these women weren't just romantic distractions. They were political players, cultural tastemakers, and in many cases, the hidden hand behind royal decisions. Louis XV's Madame de Pompadour wasn't merely a companion. She controlled patronage, influenced foreign policy, and managed court appointments. She even supported the arts and helped fund Enlightenment thinkers, all while maintaining her place in a fiercely competitive palace. Earlier, Louis XIV's Madame de Montespan famously held immense sway during her years as the king's favourite, only to later be eclipsed by Madame de Maintenon, who married Louis secretly and pushed for a more pious, reserved court. These women wielded unofficial but undeniable power. They were envied, resented, worshipped, and feared. Their salons became courts within the court. Their favour could elevate families or ruin rivals. And when love turned cold, court politics often heated up, sometimes to the point of scandalous triangles and dangerous alliances. 60. Obsession with gardens and labyrinths. To understand Versailles is to understand its gardens, not just as landscaping but as ideology. Louis XIV's gardens, designed by André Le Nôtre, were vast, symmetrical, and unnaturally perfect. Every hedge, every fountain, every gravel path was controlled, curated, and meticulously maintained. Nature, like the court, had to be tamed, but there was more than just control. Hidden within these pristine spaces were elaborate mazes and secret grottos. These weren't just decorative, they were designed for performance, mystery, and the occasional flirtation. Royal lovers might vanish into the hedges, only to return an hour later suspiciously flushed. Courtiers plotted beneath sculpted topiaries. Diplomats were impressed or intimidated by the scale. Gardens became political theatre. The Sun King held parties in them, naval mock battles on artificial lakes, and private walks that were anything but casual. To stroll the gardens of Versailles was to walk through Louis XIV's vision of order, a message in every tree. But not everything in Versailles was above ground. Some secrets ran deeper, literally, beneath its walls and floors. 59. Court love triangles and scorned favourites. At Versailles, love wasn't simple. It was a power game with powdered wigs. Romantic entanglements weren't just gossip fodder. They could shift political alliances, wreck careers, or birth new court factions. When a royal mistress lost favour, she didn't just lose affection. She lost status, influence, and often safety. Love triangles were common. Kings had mistresses, mistresses had rivals, rivals had spies. A courtier might pursue the affection of the queen's maid just to curry favour with someone higher up the chain. The dynamics were layered, strategic, and often explosive. Scorned favourites sometimes retaliated with intrigue. Some spread damaging rumours. Others tried to regain favour through elaborate gifts, desperate charm offensives, or aligning with religious factions at court. A few even resorted to darker tactics, manipulation, blackmail, or spiritual guilt-tripping. Court life was a constant performance, and romantic relationships were part of the script. But in a world so obsessed with surface beauty and elegance, the royal gardens, perfectly trimmed and full of secrets, mirrored the very chaos unfolding inside the palace walls. 62. Royal tutors as power brokers. Educating a royal child wasn't just a noble task, it was a potential stepping stone to immense influence. Tutors of future kings and queens weren't simply instructors of Latin and court etiquette. They were often the most trusted figures in a young monarch's early life, sometimes even acting as informal advisors well into adulthood. A well-placed tutor could quietly guide statecraft from behind the curtain. These tutors helped shape not only a royal's intellect, but also their worldview, moral compass, and political instincts. Some were philosophers, others clerics, and a few were shrewd manipulators who knew the value of planting ideas early. In some cases, these instructors later became ministers or spiritual guides, their proximity to power making them key players in national policy. While they rarely appeared in paintings, their fingerprints were everywhere, in the letters a king wrote, the speeches he gave, and the alliances he formed. And as their pupils rose to the throne, their teachings took on the weight of law. 61. Secret tunnels and passages in palaces. Palaces like Versailles weren't just grand, they were cleverly engineered. Beneath the public rooms and ceremonial halls lay a hidden world of tunnels, passageways, and secret doors. These architectural tricks served many purposes, facilitating discreet movement, providing emergency exits, and enabling private meetings that bypassed court protocol. Some corridors connected the king's apartments to those of his mistresses. Others allowed servants to appear and vanish like magic, maintaining the illusion of effortlessness. In times of unrest, these hidden paths became potential escape routes. Rumours swirled during the revolution of underground routes the royals could use to flee Paris, though many were never confirmed. For the royals, these hidden passages weren't just conveniences, they were lifelines. In a world built on appearances, the ability to move unseen was invaluable, because in court life, what wasn't visible often mattered more than what was. And nowhere was that more true than in the royal classroom, where future kings were trained and their tutors quietly shaped empires. 64. Queen's boxes and hidden viewers. In the theatres and chapels of Versailles, what you saw depended on where you sat. For the Queen and other high-ranking royals, specially built viewing boxes offered prime visibility and privacy. These ornately decorated enclosures allowed queens to observe ceremonies, performances, or masses while remaining partially concealed from the public gaze. But some of these boxes had more than just velvet curtains. Hidden balconies, peepholes, and concealed chambers gave royals the ability to watch without being watched. Observing court interactions from these secret spots wasn't just entertainment, it was strategy. Who applauded too loudly? Who whispered too freely? In a palace where status shifted with the breeze, seeing without being seen allowed queens to read the room and remember faces. These boxes were not just architectural features, they were instruments of soft power where silence could be louder than applause. And when it came to diplomacy, silence wasn't always an option. Sometimes gifts had to speak on a royal's behalf, especially when they were weird. 63. Royal coronation, anointing, and superstition. To be crowned King of France was not merely a political moment, it was a sacred transformation. At the heart of every coronation lay the anointing, a solemn and mysterious ritual in which holy oil, said to be divinely sent, was applied to the monarch's head, chest, and hands. This act was believed to bestow more than legitimacy. It conferred spiritual power. The oil itself, stored in a special flask known as the Sainte-Ampoule, was a relic said to have been delivered by a dove from heaven. Only the Archbishop of Reims was allowed to administer it, reinforcing the idea that kings were chosen not just by birthright, but by divine will. To many in the kingdom, the anointing made the king sacred, untouchable, unchallengeable, and more than mortal. Even skeptics played along, because undermining the ritual meant questioning centuries of tradition. And in a time when symbolism often mattered more than strategy, Superstition wasn't weakness, it was policy. 66. Royal portraits with symbolic exaggerations. French royal portraits were rarely accurate in the photographic sense, but they were never meant to be. A royal portrait wasn't a reflection, it was a message. Painters were expected to depict kings and queens not as they were, but as they wished to be seen. Taller, stronger, calmer, more regal. Flaws were softened, posture was perfected, and accessories became allegories. A sword might represent justice, a hand on a globe, dominion, a raised eyebrow, command. And if the king happened to look 10 years younger and 6 inches taller, all the better. Some monarchs loved these exaggerations. Others reportedly disliked their portraits for being too flattering, knowing they set expectations they couldn't meet. Still, the tradition endured, and portraits became one of the most consistent tools of royal self-promotion. They hung in embassies, city halls, and ballrooms, wordless reminders of who ruled and how magnificently. Of course, what the canvas couldn't capture was the reality beneath the rouge, especially when it came to cleanliness, or the lack thereof. 65. Exotic gifts and diplomacy as spectacle. When French kings wanted to impress or intimidate foreign rulers, they didn't just send letters, they sent giraffes, or a mechanical organ, or an ornate box containing mercury. Royal diplomacy in early modern France was as much about spectacle as it was about alliances. Exotic animals, rare spices, strange inventions, and priceless artifacts were exchanged between monarchs to signal wealth, power, and good taste. These gifts weren't casual, they were deeply curated, chosen to reflect both cultural sophistication and personal dominance. Receiving a gift that no one else in Europe had wasn't just a delight, it was a statement. Louis XIV famously gave mechanical marvels and artistic treasures to foreign dignitaries, blending politics with performance. These offerings weren't always useful, but they were always unforgettable. They reinforced the idea that France was the cultural capital of Europe and that its king was the ultimate connoisseur of everything from philosophy to peacocks. But if gifts dazzled others, portraits dazzled the self, especially when the royal ego needed just a little more paint. 68. Royal jewellery thefts and secret hiding. Royal jewels were more than accessories. They were political symbols, dowries, bribes, and backup plans, which made them prime targets for theft, even from inside the palace. Over the centuries, there were multiple cases of royal jewellery disappearing mysteriously. Sometimes it was during times of chaos, like the Revolution. Other times it happened in plain daylight, with insider help suspected but never confirmed. Some queens, fearing seizure or scandal, reportedly hid their gems in the hems of dresses or secret drawers behind wall panels. Others trusted loyal servants to smuggle pieces out during escapes or regime changes. The famous French crown jewels were stolen during the Revolution in a brazen raid on the Garde Meuble, with much of the treasure never recovered. Thefts weren't just financial losses, they were blows to royal image. Jewels were power made portable. When they vanished, so did the illusion of control. And sometimes, even grand public processions couldn't distract from what was missing. 67. Royal personal hygiene oddities. Despite their shimmering wardrobes and marble palaces, French royals often held curious attitudes toward hygiene. Bathing was not a daily ritual for most monarchs. In fact, it was sometimes viewed with suspicion. Many believed that too much bathing could weaken the body or open pores to illness. Instead, cleanliness was maintained with scented powders, perfumed gloves, and copious amounts of fabric to separate skin from soil. Louis XIV, for example, had an aversion to water and preferred dry cleaning methods, with servants using linen cloths and alcohol-based solutions to freshen his skin. His court followed suit, layering themselves in fragrance and lace. This wasn't considered neglect, it was elite fashion meeting medical theory. Perfume wasn't just decorative, it was defensive. Scents covered not only bodily odors, but also bad air, which many thought caused disease. Cleanliness, therefore, became a matter of olfactory illusion. Yet beneath the scent of roses, intrigue still simmered, including thefts from the very coffers of royal splendor. 71. Royal children raised by wet nurses. Royal parents were expected to love their children from a respectful distance. In French court tradition, royal infants were typically handed over to a carefully chosen wet nurse shortly after birth. These women weren't just caregivers, they were part of a specialized system meant to raise heirs in sanitized, structured environments away from emotional entanglements. The practice wasn't unique to France, but it was especially formalized there. Wet nurses fed and cared for the babies, while governesses and tutors later shaped their manners and minds. The royal parents, meanwhile, visited periodically, often in staged encounters surrounded by attendants. This separation was thought to protect the child's health and secure their status, but it also created emotional distance. Many future monarchs grew up closer to their staff than to their own families, learning early that affection and power rarely shared the same room. And when those children grew older, the pressure to produce heirs, quietly, perfectly, and without scandal, brought its own set of hidden dramas. 70. Royal patronage of weird inventions. French kings had a long history of backing inventions that straddled the line between visionary and absurd. Being a patron of science and technology was fashionable, but it also gave monarchs a reputation for forward-thinking brilliance, even when the ideas themselves were questionable. Mechanical birds, automatic harpsichords, water-powered stage effects, and elaborate automata were all funded by royal coffers at one point or another. Some worked beautifully, others never made it past the prototype phase. Louis XV had a particular interest in gadgets and curiosities, commissioning devices that ranged from useful innovations to mechanical novelties designed solely to amaze visitors. These inventions were showcased at court, like party tricks, entertaining, puzzling, and sometimes unintentionally hilarious. But behind the spectacle was a clear motive: to associate the crown with progress, genius, and modernity. Because even if the device failed, the king still looked like a visionary. Still, the future was not built by gadgets alone. It was shaped by the people raised to inherit it. And those people, from their earliest days, were raised far from their royal parents. 69. Royal processions ending in disaster. In theory, a royal procession was meant to inspire awe. Crowds lined the streets, trumpets blared, velvet-draped carriages rolled by with choreographed majesty. But in practice, these public displays often devolved into logistical chaos, weather-related mishaps, or outright crowd control nightmares. There were stampedes when crowds surged too close to the royals. Horses sometimes bolted. Carriages got stuck in mud or collided with one another. One coronation festival was so poorly managed that several people died in the crowd, leading to panic rather than celebration. These incidents were usually smoothed over in official reports, reframed as spirited or passionate displays of loyalty. But the truth was simpler. No amount of planning could perfectly contain the variables of public spectacle, and in the delicate dance between order and adoration, even the smallest misstep could become a symbolic stumble. Of course, monarchs didn't just rely on carriages to impress. Sometimes they bankrolled something even stranger, inventions that belonged more to fantasy than function. 74. Royal collections of curiosities, cabinets of wonders. Long before museums became public, monarchs curated their own, private, elite, and bizarre. Known as cabinets de curiosités, these rooms were filled with oddities, preserved animals, fossilized creatures, strange minerals, mechanical toys, ancient artifacts, and unexplainable objects collected from expeditions across the globe. These collections weren't organized by scientific method, but by aesthetic, things that amazed, confused, or delighted. A two-headed snake? Perfect. A narwhal tooth mistaken for a unicorn horn? Even better. Louis XIV and his successors kept such cabinets not only as conversation starters, but as physical proof of their reach and refinement. To be shown a monarch's cabinet was a privilege. It meant stepping into the king's imagination, a space where knowledge met spectacle. But even as kings surrounded themselves with wonders, the passing of time forced many to consider how and where they'd spend their final years. Some turned away from court life entirely, seeking solace not in gold but in stone. 73. Royal disguises at masquerade balls. Versailles loved a good illusion, and few events delivered like a masquerade. These glittering affairs weren't just elaborate parties. They were temporary reversals of power, identity, and expectation. Royals wore disguises, servants dressed as nobles, identities blurred behind velvet masks and feathered costumes, and for a few hours everyone pretended the court wasn't a pressure cooker of surveillance and hierarchy. Kings and queens mingled with courtiers without the burden of rank, and flirtations bloomed in the anonymity. Louis XV reportedly enjoyed attending in disguise to eavesdrop, tease, and test loyalties without revealing himself. Of course, most people knew who was who. Versailles wasn't that big, but the charade was part of the charm. Underneath the satin and lace, real intrigue stirred, secret conversations were had, alliances whispered, scandals born. A single night's encounter might ripple through court for months, and while the masks came off at dawn, the consequences rarely did. But some royal collections didn't end with costumes. Some monarchs were collectors of curiosities, fascinated by the strange, the rare, and the vaguely disturbing. 72. Queen's secret pregnancies and miscarriages. Hidden in the royal court, a queen's body was a matter of state, especially her womb. The pressure to produce heirs was immense, and every pregnancy was a national event. But when those pregnancies ended prematurely, as they often did, the news didn't always reach the public. Miscarriages were quietly concealed, disguised as illnesses, or not acknowledged at all. It wasn't simply about privacy, it was about political optics. A failed pregnancy could be seen as a failure of dynasty, casting doubt on succession and stirring dangerous rumours. Queens often endured these losses surrounded by servants, midwives, and silence. Medical understanding was limited, and the emotional toll was expected to remain hidden. The pressure to try again came swiftly. Even within the palace walls, only the most trusted attendants might know the truth. In public, the Queen appeared serene, her burdens tucked behind brocade and etiquette. But in the gilded quiet, another plan would be underway. Not to grieve, but to distract. And what better distraction than a royal masquerade? 77. Daily humiliations to flatter status. In the hyper-controlled world of Versailles, humiliation was not a punishment. It was protocol. Nobles begged for the right to perform the most mundane tasks for the king, handing him his gloves, helping him into his shirt, or holding the royal chamber pot. Yes, really. These rituals weren't about efficiency. They were symbolic gestures, each a reminder of the king's dominance and the courtier's desperation to be useful. Even the highest-ranking nobles could be denied a role in the king's daily routine, which meant losing face in front of the entire court. Conversely, being allowed to hand the king a glass of water during a meal could boost one's status overnight. Everything, from who stood where to who touched what, was politically loaded. For those not granted a role, the message was simple: you're not relevant. It was performance hierarchy at its finest. But every now and then, amid all the formality, someone would break script, through music, verse, or a well-timed interruption. 76. Royal foreign love matches and awkward politics. When French kings married foreign princesses, it was rarely for love, it was strategy, and strategy always came with side effects. Queens like Marie Antoinette arrived with accents, customs, and entourages that clashed with French expectations. The results ranged from charming novelty to national suspicion. Marie Antoinette's Austrian heritage, for example, became a permanent target. She was accused of favouring Austrian interests, wasting French money, and bringing foreign morals to Versailles, none of which helped her public image. Other queens, like Catherine de' Medici from Italy, also faced decades of scrutiny before winning acceptance. Cultural friction turned into political tension. Court gossip exaggerated every difference. Fashion choices became statements. Meals became controversies. The Queen's very presence was interpreted through the lens of foreign threat. Marrying abroad may have helped secure peace treaties or trade deals, but it rarely guaranteed peace at home. And to remind everyone who was still in charge, the king often doubled down on daily displays of power, sometimes with rituals designed to humble even the highest nobility. 75. Royal retirement cloisters. Not all monarchs wanted to die on a throne. Some, particularly queens and widowed royals, chose to retire to cloisters or religious houses late in life. These weren't acts of exile or disgrace, they were calculated retreats, often filled with quiet power. Former queens would don monastic garb, fund chapels, and live among nuns while still maintaining political influence through correspondence and visits from court allies. Catherine de' Medici's daughter, Marguerite, for instance, spent her later years in relative seclusion while maintaining ties to royal politics. These cloisters became sanctuaries, away from the eyes of Versailles, where contemplation replaced court games, or at least slowed them down. The ritual of royal retirement was both personal and public. It offered a dignified exit from spectacle, a way to transform from queen to holy figure. But even in withdrawal, the influence lingered, especially if the queen came from foreign lands and carried baggage the court never forgot. 80. Royal attempts to legislate. Morality. French kings occasionally tried to control more than just politics. They aimed to govern morality itself. Sumptuary laws were passed to regulate what people could wear, eat, or spend based on their social rank. The logic was simple: keep society ordered and remind everyone of their place. The execution, however, was less elegant. These laws dictated fabric types, colors, and accessories. Only certain ranks could wear gold embroidery. Others were banned from using silk or lace. Some laws even targeted food, forbidding certain classes from consuming delicacies reserved for the elite. Enforcement was spotty. Resistance was widespread. The court often broke its own rules, and wealthy merchants flaunted forbidden fashions as a display of defiance. Still, the laws sent a message: moral order starts with visible order. If the tailor gets out of line, society follows. But sometimes rules weren't enough to maintain order, especially when banquets themselves became platforms for absurd indulgence. 79. Royal fashion blunders scandalous. In a place like Versailles, where appearances could make or break a career, even the smallest fashion misstep could ignite a firestorm of gossip. A hemline deemed too short, a gown too revealing, a hairstyle too absurd, even by powdered wig standards. The royal court noticed everything and mocked just as quickly. Marie Antoinette often found herself at the centre of fashion controversy. When she wore the chemise à la reine, a lightweight flowing white dress that resembled underwear more than court attire, she scandalized Paris. Critics called it undignified, inappropriate, even anti-French. Never mind that it was comfortable and stylish. The damage was done. These so-called fashion blunders weren't just about clothes. They were read as moral signals, political messages, even cultural betrayals. One poorly chosen outfit could launch 1,000 pamphlets. In a kingdom built on spectacle, fashion wasn't frivolous, it was strategy. And sometimes monarchs tried to enforce their own version of fashion strategy with the help of actual laws. 78. Royal music and spoken word interludes. Versailles wasn't only a theatre of power, it was often a literal theatre. Kings and queens weren't just patrons of the arts, they were performers, participants, and occasional show stealers. During dinners, ceremonies, or informal gatherings, royalty would sometimes break into recitations of poetry, sing a popular aria, or even perform scenes from courtly dramas. Louis XIV, of course, had set the tone earlier with his balletic performances. Later monarchs, though less inclined to dance, continued the tradition of artistic participation. These moments were usually pre-planned, a display of cultivated taste, but they could still surprise guests. Imagine being serenaded by a monarch mid-feast. This blending of art and authority helped reinforce royal sophistication. The monarch wasn't just powerful, he or she was refined, educated, emotionally attuned, and by engaging directly in the arts, they reminded the court that good taste, like power, flowed from the top down. But taste, as always, was in the eye of the beholder, and when a royal misstepped in fashion, the court never let them forget it. 83. Queen's secret corridors connecting to confessors' rooms. The queens of France weren't just concerned with appearances, they also had private spiritual lives. And when public confession wasn't discreet enough, architecture stepped in. Some royal palaces, including Versailles, featured hidden corridors that linked the queen's private chambers directly to a chapel or confessor's room. This allowed queens to receive religious guidance without the scrutiny of courtiers or political eavesdroppers. Confession in royal circles was more than a religious obligation. It was often a form of emotional survival. With the eyes of Europe upon them, queens sought moments of quiet in an otherwise unrelenting public existence. These secret paths offered sanctuary, a liminal space between court performance and private conscience. Of course, palace servants knew about them, so did a few ministers. And so did the gossip mongers who whispered about what sins were confessed and what decisions were made behind those chapel doors. But the corridors themselves kept their silence, unlike the declarations that sometimes emerged in rhyme. 82. Royal paranoia around letters and correspondence. In a world where one wrong word could exile a noble or ignite a scandal, royal correspondence was a delicate art and a risky one. Letters between monarchs, mistresses, ministers, and family members were heavily guarded, often sealed with elaborate wax stamps or written in coded language. The stakes? Exposure, embarrassment, or worse, political fallout. Kings like Louis XV and Louis XVI kept personal secretaries to handle their most sensitive missives, while couriers were carefully vetted to avoid interception. And still, leaks happened. Some letters were discovered by spies or enemies and used as ammunition in court intrigues or revolutionary pamphlets. Others, particularly between lovers or secret allies, were hidden in double-bottom drawers or behind false walls. Even seemingly harmless notes could become weapons in the right hands. Words were power, and the right phrase in the wrong envelope could bring down a favourite, break a treaty, or unravel a throne. So, when privacy was paramount, some queens took secrecy to architectural extremes. 81. Royal banquets with odd courses. Dining with royalty was never just about the food, it was theatre. Banquets served at Versailles or Fontainebleau featured dishes so elaborate they bordered on surreal. Roasted peacocks served with feathers reattached, pies that sang when opened, thanks to hidden birds, or meat moulded into the shapes of swans and mythical creatures were not uncommon. Beyond the visuals, ingredients were curated for rarity. Gold leaf was sprinkled on desserts. Exotic fruits arrived from overseas colonies. Sugar sculptures depicted entire battle scenes or mythological dramas. Even the tableware made statements. Crystal goblets, gold-plated cutlery, and porcelain centerpieces that could rival sculptures. The goal wasn't to nourish, it was to overwhelm. Every course reminded guests of the crown's reach, wealth, and ability to turn even dinner into dominance. But not all indulgence was visible. Some power plays were written, folded, sealed, and feared, especially when the letters came with wax seals and maybe invisible ink. 86. Royal escape via underground sewer or tunnels. Not all royal exits were made on gilded carriages. In moments of crisis, especially during the Revolution, rumours swirled about the royals plotting their escape through underground tunnels, secret sewer paths, or concealed doorways hidden in palace walls. Some of these tunnels actually existed. Others were the stuff of paranoid fantasy. Versailles, the Tuileries, and other royal residences were said to have labyrinthine networks built beneath them, originally intended for discreet servant movement or emergency retreats. As tensions rose, these passages gained new significance. The idea of a queen vanishing through a hidden sewer or the king escaping under cover of night captured both the imagination and the anxiety of a nation on the brink. Though most attempts failed, or never happened at all, the very existence of these escape routes revealed how fragile the illusion of royal control had become. Thrones could crumble overnight, and all that remained might be a name, which itself could carry an entire political agenda. 85. Royal act of kissing, hands of saints. Religious pageantry in the French monarchy wasn't limited to attending mass or funding abbeys. It included deeply symbolic and sometimes odd rituals, such as the king ceremonially kissing the hands or relics of saints. This act wasn't just piety, it was propaganda. It placed the king visually and spiritually close to sainthood, reinforcing the divine right of kings. In grand ceremonies, a monarch might process into a cathedral, kneel before a relic, say a finger bone of a martyr or a shroud fragment, and kiss it with theatrical reverence. The act was highly choreographed, with incense, choirs, and a full audience of bishops and nobles. But behind the incense and iconography was a clear political message. Holiness supports the crown. Whether or not the king believed in the miracle of relics didn't matter. The spectacle itself was the point, because when your power hinges on divine right, kissing bones is less superstition and more stagecraft. Still, when divine protection failed, escape became the next best plan. 84. Royal proclamations in poetry or verse. For some French monarchs, issuing royal decrees wasn't just a bureaucratic task. It was a chance to show off their literary flair. In rare moments, kings would deliver edicts or public addresses in the form of poetry or ornate prose, turning state policy into a lyrical performance. It was absurd, theatrical, and deeply on-brand for a monarchy that fused power with pageantry. These poetic proclamations weren't always well received. Some were mocked for being tone-deaf or overly indulgent, but they reinforced a key idea. The king wasn't just a ruler, he was an intellectual, a patron, a Renaissance man. Louis XIV in particular loved theatrical flourish and used every opportunity to elevate even the mundane to mythic proportions. Still, mixing art and law could be a risky game. It opened the door to satire, parody, and misinterpretation. And when words alone weren't enough to elevate a monarch's status, there were always saints and their relics to lend a little divine shine. 89. Queen's cosmetics and beauty secrets. Behind the powdered perfection of France's most famous queens were arsenals of beauty tools, many of them toxic. White lead face powder, mercury-laced creams, and rouge with questionable ingredients were staples of the royal vanity. The goal was porcelain skin, vivid cheeks, and a look so polished it defied mortality. The cost? Well, let's just say court beauty came with side effects. Marie Antoinette's routines were legendary, including perfumed baths, floral poultices, and a carefully curated collection of lotions. But beneath the luxury lurked a darker truth. Many of these beauty secrets were medically dubious at best, harmful at worst. Skin deteriorated, hair thinned, but the illusion held, and that was all that mattered. Beauty at court was not about health, it was about artifice, discipline, and status. To appear flawless was to signify control, and when sickness came knocking, some monarchs turned not to doctors, but to the next strange promise of healing. 88. Royal fascination with mirrors and optics. The French royal court didn't just reflect power metaphorically, it did so quite literally, through an obsession with mirrors and optical effects. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, where 357 glass panes amplified every flicker of candlelight, every embroidered hem, every royal glare. It wasn't just architectural excess, it was psychological strategy. Mirrors in royal spaces did more than decorate. They distorted, they multiplied presence, extended grandeur, and made every movement seem choreographed by divine geometry. Optical illusions were built into fountains, garden mazes, and ceremonial halls. The king's image, reflected from every angle, became a kind of omnipresence. To see oneself reflected in the same glass as the monarch was to be reminded you were in his world. Light, illusion, and control, all fused into marble and glass. But behind that shining face, another obsession loomed: beauty. And when beauty became a courtly obligation, queens paid a higher price than most. 87. Royal children's names as political statements. In the French monarchy, naming a royal child wasn't a family affair, it was diplomacy, branding, and legacy rolled into one. Every name chosen for a dauphin or princess carried layers of political meaning. A Louis signalled continuity, a Stanislas, an alliance with Poland, a Marie, a gesture to faith, or perhaps to appease a powerful in-law. These names were carefully curated to reflect treaties, alliances, and ancestral claims. They could honour maternal bloodlines, reinforce succession claims, or subtly signal a political pivot. To the untrained ear, a name was just a name, but to courtiers and foreign ambassadors, it was a memo wrapped in lace. Even middle names mattered. They were often stuffed with saints, dynastic references, and geopolitical chess moves. It was a naming tradition that said, this child belongs not just to us, but to history. And as the child grew, they often stepped into roles and rooms designed to reflect that weight. Rooms that sometimes shimmered, sparkled, or played tricks on the eyes. 92. Royal eyes as political tools. In a court where speech was risky and alliances were always shifting, eyes became weapons. The king's gaze could elevate or destroy. A prolonged glance signalled favour. Averted eyes signalled disgrace. Entire careers rose and fell on whether or not the monarch deigned to look your way during a morning lever or an evening banquet. Louis XIV was especially calculated with his eyes. He was known to scan the room slowly, deliberately, choosing who to acknowledge. Those who were ignored knew they'd fallen from grace. Courtiers practiced their entrances in mirrors, rehearsed bows, and trained their expressions to be at once humble and noticeable, always hoping for a flicker of recognition. In this atmosphere, a single look could set gossip afire. A queen's glance across a ballroom might spark rumours of secret alliances or forbidden romance. And when it came to guarding what truly mattered, jewels, identity, escape plans, queens made sure their secrets were hidden far beyond the reach of a stray glance. 91. Royal adoption of non-royal favourites. In the glittering chaos of Versailles, bloodlines weren't the only route to power. Some monarchs unofficially adopted favourites, commoners, lovers, protégés, and elevated them to near-royal status. These favourites often received estates, titles, and responsibilities far beyond their birthright. It was nepotism, yes, but it was also emotional. Louis XV's affection for Madame de Pompadour wasn't merely romantic. She became a de facto minister, an arts patron, a foreign policy whisperer. Others, less famous, were granted lands or positions in exchange for loyalty, companionship, or discretion. Some were treated like surrogate children, shielded from court politics, but richly rewarded behind the scenes. These arrangements blurred the lines between public office and personal favour. Courtiers seethed, pamphleteers had a field day, and the public occasionally erupted in outrage. But within the palace, power flowed where affection pointed, and in a place ruled by glances and gestures, even a king's look could make or unmake a future. 90. Royal health fads and bizarre regimens. The French monarchy had access to the best medical minds of their time, and still they often preferred bizarre cures. From spa waters in the Pyrenees to regimented bloodletting, royal health was a parade of hopeful experiments. Some drank mercury-infused tonics, others swore by crushed pearls, steam baths, or strict diets involving nothing but boiled chicken. Louis XIV reportedly consulted astrologers as much as physicians. Marie Antoinette was sent to take the waters at various health retreats. Elixirs and miracle potions came and went, often promoted by court quacks who knew how to flatter while prescribing nonsense. Kings endured enemas, fasting and extreme purging rituals to maintain balance in their humours. It wasn't just about feeling well, it was about projecting vitality and invincibility. And when wellness couldn't be achieved through science, sometimes it was manufactured through the invention of legacy, including creating heirs and favourites who, while not born of queens, were treated like royalty. 95. Royal name changes and style changes. In the kingdom of velvet titles and powdered hierarchies, names were far more than identifiers. They were instruments of transformation. French royals often changed names or adopted new styles throughout their lives, usually to mark transitions in power, inheritance, or political realignment. A prince might be born with one name, known by another during his youth, and crowned with yet another upon accession. For example, Louis Philippe became King of the French rather than King of France, signalling a shift in ideology. Even before coronation, heirs received stylized names tied to territories or dynasties: Duke of Orleans, Dauphin of France, Prince of the Blood. These changes weren't just symbolic, they were tools for diplomacy, allegiance, and even reinvention. A new name could mean a break from a scandalous past, a claim to a foreign throne, or a nod to strategic alliances. But as customs evolved, so too did the styles, sometimes borrowing from foreign courts in ways that stirred excitement or unease. 94. Royal duels fought over honour, not death. While actual combat was rare among monarchs themselves, the French court was no stranger to duels. These weren't the cinematic showdowns you might imagine. They were often tightly choreographed affairs focused more on symbolism than bloodshed. A scratch, a flourish, or a dramatic insult was enough to settle a point of honour. Seconds were present, rules were observed, outcomes were managed. Dueling among the nobility functioned as a coded language of status and masculine etiquette. A perceived slight, even over a chair at court, could spark a formal challenge. But more often than not, the real goal wasn't death, it was narrative control. A successful duel proved you were brave, composed, and, crucially, favoured by powerful patrons. For the royals, sponsoring or tolerating such events was a way of letting courtiers blow off steam without erupting into real rebellion. Better a theatrical conflict with a rapier than a quiet one with a petition. Of course, titles weren't the only thing that changed over time. Sometimes the royals themselves changed names. 93. Queen's secret wardrobes and hidden jewellery caches. The average closet at Versailles might hold silk, satin, lace, and a few dozen fans. A queen's private wardrobe? That could include secret panels, false bottoms, and concealed caches of priceless gems. Royal women, ever aware of the volatility of court life, sometimes hid their most valuable items behind embroidery, inside furniture, or within concealed compartments known only to their closest confidants. These hidden troves served multiple purposes: escape preparation, privacy from nosy attendants, or a safety net in case of sudden downfall. During times of unrest, like the Revolution, some queens reportedly used these secret spots to stash jewelry before fleeing, some of which was never recovered. Entire fortunes may still be hidden behind palace walls or buried in estates lost to time. Wardrobes weren't just for fashion. They were fortresses, archives, and vaults. And when duels over pride or protocol erupted, it was often these very trinkets, and the status they implied, that lay just beneath the fight. 98. Royal jewels hidden in clothing seams. French royals didn't always rely on vaults to protect their treasures. Sometimes the safest place to hide priceless jewels was on their person, literally. During moments of upheaval or travel, queens and noblewomen often sewed diamonds, pearls, and rings into the hems of dresses, sleeves, or corsets. These secret compartments allowed royals to carry escape funds or diplomatic gifts while maintaining an air of elegance. It was an act of quiet defiance and survival. The Revolution saw many such efforts as members of the royal family attempted to flee or prepare for arrest. Some jewels smuggled out this way resurfaced years later in foreign auctions. This method wasn't just practical, it was intimate. A queen might walk into a reception wearing not just courtly finery, but the last remnants of her family fortune stitched into every seam. But sometimes secrecy wasn't enough. Sometimes the monarch had to vanish in plain sight to test his people. 97. Kings mirrored wardrobes and endless suits. Fashion at the French court wasn't about creativity. It was about consistency, spectacle, and dominance. And few did it better than kings who filled their mirrored wardrobes with dozens of nearly identical suits. Why? Because repetition was power. It suggested total control, bottomless wealth, and an almost theatrical indifference to novelty. Louis XIV, ever the master of optics, commissioned wardrobes with mirrored interiors, designed not just for reflection, but for staging. Every morning he performed the lever, the ritual of dressing in front of selected courtiers, surrounded by reflections of his own grandeur. His suits were coordinated to his daily schedule, the weather, and even political intent. Having 20 variations of the same coat in subtly different fabrics wasn't eccentric, it was strategic. It ensured continuity and discouraged court gossip about wardrobe changes. And just in case things ever went sideways, some royals made sure their wardrobe could do more than impress. It could hide the family jewels. 96. Royal adoption of foreign customs. French royals didn't exist in a vacuum. Marriages to foreign princesses and diplomatic exchanges brought an influx of customs, clothing, languages, and even table manners. Some of these foreign elements were embraced at court, like the Spanish etiquette introduced by queens of Habsburg descent. Others caused friction. Marie Antoinette, for example, introduced Austrian customs that clashed with French sensibilities. Her preference for casual salons, rustic retreats, and foreign fashions made her seem alien to many courtiers. Some saw her choices as charmingly cosmopolitan. Others whispered of cultural betrayal. These customs weren't merely decorative. They impacted protocol, wardrobe, religious practices, and even food. Court rituals adjusted, titles shifted. Architecture and music evolved to reflect blended influences. But every borrowed tradition came with political baggage and sometimes visible backlash. And when all else failed, some monarchs leaned into sheer volume, including rows and rows of nearly identical outfits designed to ensure they were never seen wearing the same thing twice. 100. Royal ghost stories and haunted palaces. Centuries of opulence, betrayal, and dramatic exits left more than just dusty tapestries behind. They birthed legends. French royal palaces like Versailles and the Tuileries became fertile ground for ghost stories. Staff and visitors have long whispered of apparitions wandering gilded halls, candles flickering in empty rooms, or disembodied voices echoing through royal chambers. Marie Antoinette's ghost is one of the most famous. Some say she has been seen in the gardens of Versailles, retracing her final days. Others report sightings of mysterious figures near the Queen's Hamlet, or strange chills in the Hall of Mirrors. During the French Revolution, rumours swirled that the spirits of former kings haunted the Tuileries as a grim reminder of royal downfall. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the palaces themselves seem to breathe with memory. Creaking floors, cold draughts, and eerie silences feel less like coincidence and more like history refusing to rest. In these echo chambers of grandeur and grief, one thing remains certain. The past is never quite gone. It just changes costumes. 99. Royal test journeys. Now and then, a French king would shed his silks and titles, not literally of course, and embark on a journey under disguise or with minimal entourage. These so-called test journeys served to gauge public sentiment, observe real life outside the palace gates, or simply indulge a sense of adventure. Louis XV, for example, is said to have travelled incognito as the Comte de Lussac to tour the countryside. Such excursions gave monarchs a brief taste of anonymity and, ironically, control. By seeing without being seen, they could spy on public opinion, overhear tavern talk, or assess local officials. But the trips were never truly secret. Word always spread. Locals bowed extra low to unknown nobles who happened to resemble the king. Still, the ritual allowed kings to imagine they were in touch with their subjects, a fantasy both comforting and perhaps delusional. And while kings dreamed of simplicity, the castles they left behind were anything but. Some were said to echo with footsteps long after the monarchy fell.